David Gellis, welcome back to the show, bud.
Thank you so much for having me.
Congratulations on your new book. I'm going to mangle the pronunciation of his name. Is it Yves Chouinard?
You did indeed mangle it. It's Yvon Chouinard. Yvon Chouinard.
Yvon Chouinard. Okay.
There you go. Unmangled.
That's not the first mess you'll have to clean up of mine. How did you get interested in Yvon Chouinard?
I first met Yvon Chouinard writing my very first book 10 years ago, which we've spoken about on this pod, I think, which was called Mindful Work, which was about how meditation and Buddhism was showing up in corporate America. I'm one of the weird people who has both a life as a Buddhist and also a life as a business reporter. And in looking for business leaders who had some relationship with some kind of Dharma, Chouinard came onto my radar. And now he's not a Buddhist. He's never practiced formal meditation. However, he has drawn deep inspiration from Zen Buddhism, and in particular, Zen's focus on simplicity and sort of getting to the essence of things. And he's used that over the course of his career to inspire his product design. And so I spoke with him about that 10 years ago, and then just kept covering the company because, as I found out about, it's a really remarkable company for all sorts of reasons.
Didn't Steve Jobs have a very similar interest in Zen? Like, he wasn't a practitioner, but it inspired some of the designs of Apple products?
Yeah, and my understanding of Steve is that he actually went a bit deeper down the formal practice and study route than Chouinard ever did. Jobs, if I recall, had a personal relationship, perhaps even with Suzuki Roshi. So there were some real touch points with people who were part of Dharma lineages on the Jobs story. Chouinard never had that. You know, this is a guy who was sort of reading random Zen books he could find along the way and drawing inspiration as he interpreted it.
Got it. So what's his basic story?
The basic story is that Yvon Chouinard was born in the woods of Maine in 1938 to a Quebecois French-speaking family. Didn't speak English until he was 10 years old, but from a very early age was completely enthralled by the outdoors. When he was about 10 years old, his family moved to California, where he had to learn English very quickly. And also, as he sort of tried to integrate into Southern California life, very clearly discovered that he didn't fit the mold of sort of a traditional American kid. He was cutting class, chasing frogs in the Los Angeles River, had no patience for traditional academic life. And as he became a teenager and a young man, really went deep into the life of an outdoorsman. Never went to college, but sort of became a self-taught, real badass rock climber. One of the people who, this is late 50s, early 60s now, was putting up like first ascents on some of the biggest granite walls in Yosemite Valley and in the Grand Tetons. And through that, started making his own rock climbing equipment because he needed to, because they were doing these crazy climbs and he couldn't find the right equipment he needed. And then from his time as a manufacturer of rock climbing gear, ultimately started the clothing company that would become Patagonia.
In this context, what is a dirtbag?
Yeah. So the word dirtbag, I get a lot of sort of raised eyebrows, like, so you don't like the guy. But in Yvon Chouinard's conception of the word, he's a self-identified dirtbag. A dirtbag in the outdoors community refers to someone who is so unenamored with material possessions that they are content to sleep in the dirt because they would rather be closer to nature, closer to their next adventure, and really have found no valuable cause for all the luxuries that we associate with modernity. And so Yvon Chouinard's proudly a dirtbag. The label that he really bristles at is billionaire.
But he is a billionaire nonetheless.
Well, he was, but he gave it away, and we can get to that.
Right. Okay, so let's before we get to the giving away part, let's talk about some of the ways in which he ran his company that were noteworthy. I mean, I have on here on my list like his attention to taking care of his employees, his like exacting environmental standards when it comes to the supply chain, political activism. Can you just hold forth on the many ways in which he was a sort of unique corporate citizen?
Happy to, but important to note at the outset, it's not as if these things sort of emerged fully formed. Patagonia is a company that's been around for a half century now, and a lot of these things were evolutions that took place over many decades. That said, a lot of the seeds of the real impactful ways in which Patagonia would show up as a unique corporate citizen were there from the very beginning. And so just to rattle off some of the most famous ones, you mentioned taking good care of his employees. He famously titled his memoir, Let My People Go Surfing. And that refers to his conviction, which was mostly true, that if the waves were good, people ought to be surfing rather than sitting at their desks. And there's a kernel of truth to that at the company even today. I think more meaningfully was the company's commitment to women and to working mothers in particular. From the very outset, the company began offering really generous maternity benefits, going so far as to set up its own school system at the campuses. And even to this day, you've seen it evolve. And the company now, when it has a mother who's a new mom, who's nursing, who needs to take a work trip, Patagonia will pay for what it calls a companion. So if they need a wet nurse or a nanny to travel with them on a work trip, Patagonia just pays that and doesn't think twice about it. And that's the sort of like remarkable stuff that goes well above and beyond what most companies offer. Moving on to some of their political activism and conservation work, from a very early moment in the company's history, Yvon Chouinard was using some of the profits generated from the company to support local grassroots environmental activists. At first, it was peanut stuff, right? Trying to protect the local river in Ventura, California, where the company is headquartered. But you fast forward over the decades, they started giving more. They started giving to more impactful projects. And we're now at a stage where the company has literally donated hundreds of millions of dollars over the years to support conservation of wild lands in remote places all over the country. And then finally, the third I would add is the company's attention to its own supply chain. Over the course of the company's evolution, Chouinard began paying more and more attention to not only the functionality of his products, but to what those products were made of and how they were made. And that began this deep interrogation of the company's own supply chain. And it got to a place where Patagonia was really going not only to its tier 1 factories, which is to say the factories that sew the garments that actually say Patagonia on it, but going to its tier 2 and tier 3 suppliers, which are the companies that make the fabric or the dyes in the fabric, and saying, what are the working conditions like in those factories? And if we're not comfortable with it, we're not going to use products from those companies. And so those are just some of the ways in which Patagonia has distinguished itself as a really remarkable corporate citizen over the years.
You are very careful, though, not to deify this dude or the company. So let's just start with him. You describe him as micro. He can be micromanagerial. He can be aloof. Just say a little bit more about his character. Not that he's a bad guy at all, but that he's not just purely good.
Yeah, I think it's important to note here that this is not a book about any great scandal. This isn't a book about the real underbelly of business. I've written those books, I've written those stories, but this is not one of them. Instead, Yvon Chouinard is human, much like the rest of us. On the one hand, he could be a sort of brilliant product visionary, and in the same moment, he could be a completely aloof and frankly irresponsible manager and operator of the company. He could be charismatic and inspirational to his employees. And he could also be a micromanager who was quick to lash out at the people who worked for him and ultimately not trust them. And while he was incredibly generous in many ways and ultimately did renounce his fortune and commit the bulk of the company's profits to conservation and grassroots activism, he was never someone who cared a lot about rewarding the people that worked for him monetarily, which is to say, he's like the rest of us, right? He's a jumble of contradictions. He's oftentimes working at cross purposes with himself. and at times seems to contradict the things that he says he stands for. That's life.
I love that. And it's easy, though, in journalism to put people in good buckets or bad buckets,
Yeah.
to be have and this is another word I'll probably mangle, but to have like a Manichaean, I think is the term, like a Manichaean view of the world, because is what makes good copy. The last time you were on the show was to talk about Jack Welch, who you wrote a book about, and I think he's a little bit closer to the bad bucket, and none of those buckets don't exist. Everybody's, as you said, a jumble. I remember one time I was talking to Joseph Goldstein, the great meditation teacher, who this was at a point in my life where I had gotten some tough feedback about my comportment in the world, and I asked him seriously. I was like, "Am I just inherently rotten?" And he laughed at me and said, "No, only halfway, like the rest of us." And so, I applaud you for bringing some nuance to what could have been. Here's another word I could have mangled. I might mangle hagiography.
You got that one right. Yeah.
On the first try or the second try?
First try.
Okay, good. All right.
Yeah, don't second guess yourself. Well, I appreciate you noting that.
Do second guess yourself. Do second guess yourself. That's the point. Like, sometimes we should check our instinct to put people in a bucket or a box.
Big time. And that was something that I tried to do throughout the writing process. And I really, really worked on, especially in the later stages of the edits of this book. I really tried to be comfortable dwelling in that complexity and the contradictions and the nuance. And, I say in the introduction, many business books sort of offer pat lessons on how to get ahead in life. And this isn't one of them. I think I say in the introduction, this is not a self-help manual. It's more like a Zen koan, because it's a question that doesn't have one easy answer. So I appreciate you noting that.
Speaking of that, so back in the sort of more admirable side of Chouinard's behavioral repertoire, you mentioned he gave the company away. Can you put some meat on that particular bone?
Yeah, I'm always cautious here not to get too in the weeds of sort of corporate governance and equity structures, but just to do it as quickly and as simply as I can. 3 years ago, it was the situation where Patagonia was still a privately held corporation, and all of the equity, all of the stock in the company was owned by Chouinard and his immediate family, his wife and 2 children. There were 2 classes to that stock, voting stock and non-voting stock. That's typical in the way many companies are structured, but they owned all of it. And so what they did was they took the 2% of voting shares, which is all the voting shares, but 2% of the overall stock, and they put it in a newly formed entity called a purpose trust. That's a legal entity that you can set up in California that essentially just holds a bucket of stock or money and is instructed on what to do with it. Pause there. They took the 98% of the other equity, the rest of the equity, the non-voting shares, and put all of that in a series of new 501c4 nonprofit organizations. And then they had a structure that works like this. The Purpose Trust, which has the voting shares, instructs Patagonia Inc., the ongoing concern, a for-profit C Corp incorporated in California. The Purpose Trust instructs the C Corp to donate 100% of the profits not reinvested in the company to the 501c4s, the Holdfast Collective. And the Holdfast Collective gives away those monies on an ongoing basis. And that money amounts to like $100 million a year. And in doing so, the Chouinards really did renounce their claim to the fortune. They no longer own the equity. It's locked up in these new legal entities, and it's not going anywhere anytime soon.
What motivated that decision on his part and the family's part?
I think motivation's an incredibly important word in this conversation. And I would even just take us back to try to examine the motivations of Chouinard and his family for the 50 years that led up to this decision. And the way I'd sum it up is that they've never been motivated by money. It's just not what got them out of bed in the morning. It's not what inspired them to create the company. And when it came time to figure out what a succession plan looked like at Patagonia, it was not going to be the thing that they were personally trying to hold on to. But the actual precipitating event for him to finally give away the company, as it were, came in 2017 or 18 when Forbes magazine put Chouinard on their annual list of billionaires. And when that happened, he freaked out. He called it one of the worst days of his life. He was huffing and screaming in the office, and he told people, get me off this list. Figure out how to get me off this list. Or, he threatened, he would start calling other billionaires and offering to sell the company. That then began a multi-year process where they had to figure out what a structure would look like that would allow them to give away the company, retain Patagonia in some sort of a form that it already was, and ultimately give away many more of the profits. Those were some of the criteria that they had. Took them a couple years, but then they did it. And in 2022, I broke the news in the New York Times. And it was one of the biggest stories I've ever written in my life. Just tremendous interest in how this company had managed to pull it off.
Has he been an influence in this regard on other reluctant billionaires?
I think we can give a qualified yes at this point. It's still early. These processes take many years. But what I can say is that I've personally had outreach from many founders and companies who have asked me my own take on how they can do something similar. I'm not an estate planner, so I refer them to other people very quickly. And other people I've talked to, including folks in Patagonia and at other sort of related organizations, all report that there is a real influx of family-led concerns, private companies that have been asking them for guidance on how they can think about succession planning differently. It might not be exactly the same structure, but they've definitely gotten people's attention. And there's a movement afoot to try to at least capture some of what they've done and perpetuate it.
To get back to this word motivation, what do you think is motivating that quote-unquote movement?
There's a lot of dissatisfaction with capitalism as it is right now. As we discussed last time I was on the show with my previous book, we live in an extremely unequal society, in a world in which executives and businesses are prioritizing short-term profits, often at the cost of the well-being of greater society, individuals, workers, the planet. And I think, Chouinard's not alone in recognizing that and feeling it. And what's encouraging perhaps is that he's not alone now in actually trying to do something about it beyond, making some empty corporate pledges that you put on Instagram and then go back to business as usual.
I know we talked about this last time, but I think I really want to go back into it now because it feels like, and this is unscientific, but my sense of the culture is that, especially among young people, just a really rising level of dissatisfaction about capitalism. But you're right there at the tip of the spear covering capitalism as it relates to the environment. And you started this conversation by describing yourself as a Buddhist. And so I'm just curious, where's your head at with all of this these days?
I sort of reject this claim that some people make, well, I'm an optimist, so ultimately I'm optimistic about it all. I wanted to say something like that, and I almost started, and I could just feel it was disingenuous. That's not entirely true. I'm very clear-eyed about the fact that the world and the economy are in really rough shape, and that business as we know it, and really society as we know it, is enormously extractive and is setting humanity on a multi-decade course for a really profoundly different planet with a whole lot of suffering. That's the reality of what's happening out there. Some of my optimism, as it were, is derived from the fact that I happen to live a very blessed life in many ways. Personally, I have security, I have family, I have love, I have meaningful work. But I get why people are dissatisfied. I talk to them, and they have every right to be. The sort of bargain that I think many people feel like they strike between themselves and their employer and their country and their society, a lot of those are not holding up their end of the bargain. Companies do not care for people in the same way that they did just a couple of generations ago. The federal government is not there in the way that I think a lot of people hope it would be in their times of need. So I don't at all pretend that dissatisfaction is, without good reason. But I also, to come back to that, like, all right, we got to focus on the good stories too. I also try to be clear-eyed about the fact that there's a lot of good work happening in the world. And my job is to cover all of it. I write about the bad stuff, but I also really make an intentional effort to write about the good stuff too. In the introduction, again, I have a line, I forget it verbatim, but I basically say, if we don't write stories about people who are doing good work in the world, we sort of forfeit the opportunity to have positive role models. And that's what I believe Chouinard and Patagonia ultimately can be, with all their imperfections. They show that there is a different way to do capitalism that doesn't have to suck so bad.
So you retain a sense that business can be a source for good, notwithstanding all of the many, many problems with capitalism.
That's right. I do.
How do you think about this as a Buddhist? Like, because I think about this a lot. I mean, I run my own business. If I had to whittle down our goal, it's really about the dissemination of the
Right.
Dharma plus modern science, but ways to do life better. Right there in the Eightfold Path, the Buddha's, cookbook for enlightenment, there's an entry on right livelihood, like correct or wise livelihood. So I'd just be curious, as all of these words flow out of my face, like what comes to mind for you?
Yeah, well, right livelihood was in my mind as the words were coming out of your face. I mean, I was going to invoke that too. And I think it starts right there. And that, just goes to the precept of like not doing harm. So certainly I think there are businesses that are out there actively doing bad things in the world. So like, that's not good. Try not to hold them up as arbiters of great and elevated business. And I think you can see that in like the social media giants, right? You look at the way the public narrative has changed around social media. And as we learn more about what some of these companies knew about how their products were affecting, especially young people, especially young girls, you start to understand that, what can have the veneer of a sort of fun, youthful company often has a real dark side. I think when it comes to a company like Patagonia, what was so intriguing to me is that as they discovered their own imperfections, and as they understood, as Chouinard and his team understood that some of the products they were making were causing harm, they embarked on these extensive, often expensive efforts to remedy the situation. And that is just really unusual in the course of modern American business. I mean, I've covered business for 20 plus years now. And when most companies realize that they're like, mucking up a river in Portugal, they like sweep it under the rug, like pay a PR firm to like make the problem go away and hope no one notices. Like when Patagonia found that kind of stuff, they would put up a blog post about it, shut down the factory, and proudly announce that their sales were going to dip by 5% because they weren't going to use them anymore. And that kind of self-inquiry and willingness to confront their own problems, I think is unique, but also very Buddhist in a way, right? And throughout this conversation, I've been thinking about the sort of some parallels between the way this company showed up and some of just like the basic meditation practices that we all go through in the tradition that we're both familiar with, which is, being aware of what's happening, understanding the causes and conditions that allow certain stimulus to arise. And in the cases where those causes and conditions are creating suffering, trying to do the work in a responsible way to allow for less of that stuff to come up. I mean, that's like, Patagonia wouldn't say it quite like this, but in my sort of business Buddhist mind, there's some meaningful parallels there to me.
Another parallel would be just begin again. In meditation, we start over every time we get distracted. And at Patagonia, if you're fucking up a river, you announce it and find somebody else.
That's right.
Let's be honest, shopping, not my thing. I like having nice clothes, But I really don't like going to the store and waiting in line and trying on lots of stuff and dealing with all of the choices, and also being reminded that many things that look good don't actually fit me. And that's just the in-store experience. The online experience for me can be super frustrating as well, because I'll order 3 sizes of the same shirt hoping one fits, and then I'm too lazy when none of them fit to return everything. That's why I'm recommending you check out Stitch Fix. You just take a quick style quiz, share your size, your vibe, and your budget, and boom, you're matched with a real human stylist who handles the rest. They send you a fix book with clothes that actually fit and make sense for your life, work, weekends, whatever. It saves you time, you look great, and you don't even have to think about it. It's no risk, all style. Try it all on in the comfort of your own home. Keep what works, send back the rest. Free shipping and returns always, and no subscription required. Plus, you get a free try-on for your first fix. Get started today at stitchfix.com/happier and get 20% off your first order when you buy 5 or more items. That's stitchfix.com/happier. The other thing I'm curious about with Patagonia is we talk about the things they're doing that are laudable, like self-disclosure, taking care of your employees. They also do a lot of political activism. Listeners may have varying, your mileage may vary on that. But is doing good always good for the bottom line, or do they pay a price for this stuff?
This is a great question. There's lots of scholarship around this. I think Chouinard's sort of canned answer is that it always works out in the end, but I'm not sure that's true. Maybe if you quantify the brand equity and all that kind of stuff, it's true. But at the end of the day, no, Chouinard often would deliberately throttle sales in order to use more responsible products, more responsible ingredients, as it were, in the clothing. I think the most famous instance comes in the late 80s when Chouinard and the team recognized that conventional cotton, which they were using in a ton of their products, is super toxic at the time. It had formaldehyde. The people in their stores were actually getting sick from the off-gassing from the new cotton products. They go out and look at a conventional cotton farm, and it's just a desolate wasteland. There's tons of industrial chemicals, and they're like, this stuff sucks. We're going to move to all organic cotton. This is back in the 80s. There's no organic cotton supply chain. And so what they realize is if they're going to do this, they're going to have to slash their SKUs, their number of products, by 30%. And it's probably going to mean a reduction in sales of, 20%. I'm not looking at the numbers right now, but, big, meaningful hit. And Chouinard says, I don't care. We're not using that stuff anymore. I don't care if we lose money. We're going for it. And they do it. And so in that sort of instance, I don't think you can say that doing the right thing was ultimately good for business, right? They took a real hit. Now, again, at the end of the day, and the final accounting is the fact that they transitioned to organic a net plus, maybe. But I'm always a little cautious about trying to draw too tidy of boxes around some of this. As we discussed earlier, it's a complicated story, and these are complicated questions without neat and tidy answers.
Couldn't you argue, though, that they paid a price in the short term on some of these things by throttling sales or reducing what you're calling SKUs, but the reputational benefit was enough to drive more customers to them in the long run?
I think you could, and I tried to leave room for that possibility, but I think it's super hard to know. What you can also say, what I know from my reporting is, and it just makes the final accounting for Patagonia that much harder, is that this is a company that has deliberately throttled its growth repeatedly over the years, simply because Chouinard was uncomfortable with growing too fast. And so even when things were going good and the supply chain was all working out okay, and it just stands in radical contrast to most other corporations, especially consumer products companies, that are about, growth no matter what, right? They'll take growth wherever they can get it. It's just not the case with this one.
Just getting back to you for a second, having, marinated in the Patagonia world for quite a while, did it change the way you think about your own livelihood? Would you throttle your own growth for your beliefs, et cetera, et cetera?
I don't think it's changed my views on my livelihood. I feel really blessed to be a reporter at the New York Times, which is a really extraordinary institution where we're still allowed to do independent journalism. And I just never take that for granted. And I'm fortunate to still love the craft, still love the work. What reporting this book did change was two things, I'd say. One was my own relationship with material goods and my thinking about how much stuff I need. And I think for many of us who sort of have any iota of self-reflection, that's probably an ongoing conversation we have with ourselves. But this was a moment that accelerated some of my own reflections. And the other, and I would say most profound part of my personal journey over the last few years as I wrote this book was my relationship with nature. For the reporting of this book, I had the opportunity to travel with Chouinard to some wild places, deep in the backcountry of Argentina, in some beautiful spots in Wyoming. And I took other trips with other folks in the book that led me to just some of the most spectacular, untouched, remote corners of this planet. And those experiences really had a profound effect on me, even at this stage in my life, even having spent a lot of time in nature. And it's frankly something I'm still like working through and understanding and processing and trying to figure out how, if at all, my life will change because of it.
I'm trying to think about how could your life change? I mean, I guess you could do your job from anywhere and raise your kids on an organic farm in upstate Vermont.
I don't think it's like that. To me, it's like when I have blocks of time where I can be really deliberate with how I'm spending my time. Am I going to a city to see the sights? Or am I like going deep into the wilderness with my children to be closer to mountains and away from people? And of course, it doesn't have to be either or. But I will say that the reporting for this book, and especially a trip I took to Patagonia in South America last year, really kindled in me an even deeper hunger to be very close to nature.
If I recall correctly, this was a privately held company, and and Chouinard and his team were doing things that were like contrary to to many of the basic instincts in capitalism, like unlimited growth, and you need an exit strategy, meaning sell it to somebody else and make a shit ton of money. Could they have gotten away with this if they were a public company and were, subject to the whims of Wall Street?
I don't think so.
Yeah.
And I don't think Chouinard would say they could. That's really the secret ingredient that made all this work over the years. And it's why, when I would ask Chouinard what his advice was for other companies, he said, for most companies, it's too late. If you're beholden to shareholders, if you're at the mercy of quarterly earnings reports, like good luck being ethical. Good luck telling your investors that like, sorry, we're going to throttle growth because we don't like, how a factory in Vietnam is treating its laborers. Like, great, we'll find a new CEO. Like, fuck off. It's just not the way most companies work. And so what he would say the very next beat, however, is that's why he really tries to spend his time thinking about the next generation of companies. And there be a new class of companies that draw some lessons from this and understand that once you start giving up control, once you start allowing faceless investors to sort of decide what is and isn't right or wrong, it can be very hard to sort of keep your values intact.
Do you see that happening? Do you see a new generation of companies emerging?
There's some, right? There are always green shoots. And I think certainly there's more of that dialogue and more of this awareness in the business world and in business schools than there was, say, 20 years ago. But we're still talking about, like iota in terms of revenues or in terms of number of companies compared to the vast majority of the business world. You can point to some larger ethical corporations. They're out there that sort of try to do this. But they're the exceptions that prove the rule.
I'm curious about like how much runway we have to get our shit together. I'm thinking about, when I used to cover politics when I was in my
Yeah.
20s, and a friend of mine was in the legislature, and they used to talk about good government people. Like there were like all these NGOs who were interested in good governance. They used to call them goo-goos. And there's a lot of people who are interested in good capitalism, and both on the nonprofit side and the for-profit side. But we are, as you know, because you spent a lot of time thinking about the climate, like we don't have a unlimited time to get our shit together on the climate front. And I'm just curious, like, what level of optimism you have.
Again, I sort of resist neat and tidy answers to these big existential questions. So here's how I often think about it. It's undeniable that the modern world as we know it and human activity is driving really intense global warming that recent studies suggest is not only moving quickly, but is actually accelerating. That is already making weather events more severe, making precipitation more intense, making droughts, floods, fires, storms worse. Sea levels are rising. That's also incontrovertible. And the pace of change, which is to say the pace at which we're replacing fossil fuels, which are the primary driver of this warming, with clean energy, is super slow. The pace at which we're reforming agricultural practices, which are also responsible for a huge amount of planet warming emissions, that's moving super slow. So we're not moving at a pace that's going to allow us to rapidly change our trajectory. And what that means is we're moving into a world where it's going to be a much hotter planet. And we don't know exactly what that's going to look like. In many respects, I think some people believe that the world can go on much as it does today. There are going to be a lot of challenges. There are going to be certain low-lying areas that may be uninhabitable. And there's going to be a lot of suffering as, 175 million people in a country like Bangladesh need to adapt to a world in which the majority of their agricultural lands are no longer suitable for growing food, right? There's big, thorny challenges ahead of us. And all that said, I still believe that 100 years from now, like people are going to be having conversations. I still believe 100 years from now, there's going to be education and entertainment and commerce. The world's going to be a vastly different place, and we may experience tipping points along the way. And those are big, thorny questions that we just don't know the answer to. What happens if the Gulf Stream collapses? What happens if certain Antarctic ice sheets collapse? We don't know the answers to those questions. But I try not to view the changing climate as a truly existential threat, which is to say, threat to the very survival of human civilization. Instead, I try to be really clear-eyed about the fact that things are changing fast. Our ability to counteract those changes is not nearly keeping up with the pace of change, and that there's a lot of suffering. There's just going to be a lot of suffering for a lot of people, a lot of animals, a lot of communities along the way. And that's life, right? This is the world we're in right now.
I think the Buddha had a few things to say about both change and suffering.
Yeah.
I know you said that in the book you say that this is not a business self-help tome, and we can cut this if you want, but do you have any advice for us as individual widgets within the larger capitalistic system that you can deliver after having written this book?
Sure, but I'm no self-help guru like you are, Dan.
The fact that you know me is enough for you and anybody to shed a lot of skeptical light on the notion of self-help gurus.
Yeah, I knew you before you were a guru.
Yeah, that's true.
So
my
here's
little
what
thing
I'd
is
say.
some people teach from the mountaintop. I teach from the fetal position. So,
Here's what I'd say. It gets right back to right livelihood, right? Like, if you're able to do work that you care about, it's a blessing to be able to be really invested and passionate about the work. Not everyone has that luxury. And so for those that don't, I would say try to do no harm, right? Like right livelihood doesn't mean you're like fulfilling your higher purpose, but it at some level does mean trying to avoid trades that create additional suffering in the world. That's pretty basic stuff. On the as a consumer, I would offer that people go back to that 2015 Patagonia ad in the New York Times. Don't buy this jacket, right? That was a prompt for reflection about what we actually need, right? What material goods that we so compulsively surround ourselves with are actually essential. And being really clear-eyed and deliberate about how we spend our money and the things we bring into our lives and into our homes, that's a good discipline, a good exercise, right? And it's not binary, right? Like, and I am on a journey, my friend, right? Like I buy all sorts of stuff I don't need, let me tell you. But I think being mindful of those choices is reasonable and important. And finally, I would say get into nature. I mean, I can't tell you what a profound effect it's had on me before I was writing this book. In my meditation practice, right? Like some of my most profound dharmic experiences have been when I've been really close to nature. And even out of the context of Buddhism or the Dharma, I never regret being in the woods. I never regret being in the mountains and sort of being really present with the wind in the trees and the sensation of the sun on my skin. Those are all really priceless experiences to me.
I'm curious what you tell your children. Your children may be too young to have this conversation, but I've got a lot of young people who work for me, and the vibe very much is capitalism is rigged. We fucked the planet. The younger generations, we've been screwed by your generation and your parents, and it's very hard to argue with that. And I don't want to argue with it, but I do want to do my best to recontextualize, give some perspective, give some empowering advice. Like, well, how do you think about all of that, and what would you say? What will you say to your kids when the time is right?
Yeah, I mean, they're not wrong. So let's just honor the validity of their perspective. My next question is like, all right, so what are we going to do today? Right? And like, if the answer is we're just going to throw our hands up, well, like that's pretty passive and fatalistic. And I don't want to repeat what I just said, but it's like, how do you want to show up in the world? And we can show up and we can be inured and insensitive to the suffering in the world, or we can show up like bodhisattvas and try to help. And that's right. Like it's as simple as that to me. And there's always plenty of work to do. There's always plenty of people to help. And everyone's got to find their own karma. Everyone's got to figure out what their little role as cogs of the machine is. And then, God willing, you have to go do it.
I remember reading an essay by Jonathan Franzen, I believe, in the New Yorker about climate change. If it wasn't Franzen, it was some other Jewish novelist, and he basically said something like, climate change is really fucking scary. But if there's good news, it's that it's going to provide plenty of opportunities for us to help out and create common cause with one another. And so, if I to sum up, if we take as a foundational question lurking above and throughout this conversation, can capitalism and the Dharma coexist? I think what I'm hearing from you, and I'm saying all of this for you to tell me if I'm correct or to expand upon it, is look, this is the system we were born into. For whatever karma we may have, we came out of wombs into a capitalistic system, and we all have a choice. Like, how are we going to behave within it? And yes, business can be a source for good, so you don't necessarily need to avoid, all interactions with commerce. And yes, you have agency, and you have some influence, depending on your position in the world, and do what you can where you are with what you've got. Is that a decent summation?
Sure. And everyone's got to find their own way through it. And I'm not sitting here trying to tell people what to do. But listen, this is definitely the system we're born into, no doubt about that. And then again, I just come back to this notion that we have a choice. And, I don't know if this is perfectly relevant, but it's what comes to mind. So I'll share it. I'm going to take you back to the year 2000. It was 2000. And I was with Chokanima Rinpoche, who was my original Tibetan teacher. And I'm studying with him in India, and I've been on retreat and, doing intensive practice. And a lot of young people at this time were like staying in India, right? They would do some of these retreats, and they're like, I'm going to go on this big journey. And I forget the term, but they would do, 10,000 recitations of a certain mudra, and they would do 10,000 circumambulations of the Bodhisattva. I forget what that's called, but right, they would really commit and go deep. And I sort of went to Rinpoche one day and I said, should I do this? Like, should I stay in India and just keep doing intensive practice? And Rinpoche looked at me, he's like, where were you born? I was like, I was born in New York City. He's like, you're an American. Go home. and right, what I took from it was like, that's not my work in the world, right? If I was supposed to be born as a Tibetan monk, I would have been born as a Tibetan monk. But what he was telling me, or at least what I heard, was that like I was born where I was for a reason, and not in the sort of deist, like God has a plan for me, but in the sense that like you are born into the world you are born into. And if you are fortunate to have optionality and energy and resources, then his invitation to me, as I understood it, was to figure out what right livelihood looked like in that context and in an organic way. And that's the way I sort of try to talk to my kids about their role in the world, which is I'm not trying to tell them exactly what to do, but I try to remind them that we are very blessed and a lot of other people are not as blessed. And when and if we have the opportunity to help, whether that's through our day jobs or through charitable acts, we should take that opportunity.
Well said, or as they say, or as we say in a Buddhist context, sadhu. David, two just quick questions as we sum up here, as we wrap up here. First, anything that you were hoping to get to that we didn't get to?
I could talk to you all day, my friend. Like, whatever. It's always fun.
Right back at you.
Nothing specific. Nothing specific.
Finally, then, can you just remind everybody of the name of your book and anything else that we should be checking out from you?
Well, I'm thrilled to have had this conversation. The book is Dirtbag Billionaire: How Yvon Chouinard Built Patagonia, Made a Fortune, and Gave It All Away. It's out now, and I hope you check it out.
Thank you, my friend, for making time for this. Great to talk to you as always.
Thank you for doing it. Really appreciate it. Always a pleasure.